Chapter 9 East and West. At this point, I hear some readers say the world community and the world republic of law and justice must be composed of all peoples everywhere. These are great books of the West. How can comprehension of the tradition they embody amount to participation in the world republic of learning? How can such comprehensions promote world community, since great books of the East are not included? The editors reply that there is undoubtedly to be a meeting of East and West. It is now going on under rather unsatisfactory conditions. The editors believe that those who come to the meeting with some grasp of the full range of the Western tradition will be more likely to understand the East than those who have attended any number of the hastily instituted survey courses about the East proposed by educators who have been suddenly impressed by the necessity of understanding the East, and whose notion is that the way to understand anything is to get a lot of information about it. The editors are impressed by the many reminders given to the West by Eastern thinkers that the parts of the Western tradition that are now the least known and the least respected in America are the very parts most likely to help us understand the deepest thought of the East. On the other hand, the editors are convinced that those aspects of the West which the East finds most terrifying, its materialism, rapacity, and ethnocentric pride, will get no support from those great books which indicate the main line of the Western pursuit of wisdom. The editors believe that an education based on the full range of the Western search is far more likely to produce a genuine openness about the East, genuine capacity to understand it, than any other form of education now proposed or practicable. The West can try, as the saying goes, to, quote, win the East by coming to the meetings between them with a few words adjusted directly to the questions that arise from the manner in which the East is, as the saying goes, awakening. There is no question that the West will inevitably be represented at these meetings by a good many of those social engineers who feel, in all ignorance, that they represent in splendor what 25 centuries of Western civilization have been laboring to produce: scientific humanism, which has been vigorously and in high places presented as the new religion that the new one world needs, will certainly be represented. Some representatives will surely be making the offer of the magic trio: scientific method, technology, and the American way of life. It seems safe to predict, however, that these representatives of the West are likely to be understood only by those in the East who have already decided for Westernization. These representatives of the West may be considerably nonplussed by those in the East who are determined, however much they awaken in certain aspects, to retain the central convictions and habits of thought of Eastern culture. As Ananda Kumaraswamy has said, Kumaraswamy has said, it is true that there is a modernized, uprooted East with which the West can compete. but it is only with the surviving superstitious East. Gandhi's East, the one that has never attempted to live by bread alone, that the West can cooperate. With which the West can compete, but it is only the surviving superstitious East. In seeking the cooperation of this modernized, uprooted East, the Western social engineers will find themselves, as is already menacingly clear, competing with the rulers of the Soviet Union. These rulers are bringing to the meetings of East and West a far more ruthless version of this latter-day shrunken Western voice. Their words are adjusted far more directly to the exact questions that are involved in the, quote, awakening of the East. The Russians seem prepared to offer the new Easterners a program uncomplicated by any concern about the old East. Perhaps these new Easterners, under Russian guidance, may carry through a new kind of reflexive imperialism, more ruthless toward the, quote, the superstitious East, Gandhi's East, than any Western imperialist ever was. If the East, contrary to its deepest traditions, becomes totally absorbed with material comfort, there will be little about the East that we shall have to understand, since we already understand that kind of absorption only too well. We have never pictured the East as coming to share it. If the East does come to share it, the change may shock us, but it will raise no very difficult question of understanding. If, on the other hand, the awakening East tries to retain beneath the new vigor of the drive toward material goods its various forms of traditional religion, metaphysics, and ethics, the West, in trying to cooperate with the East, has something to understand. Under these circumstances, anyone, anywhere, in or out of the universities, who has attained some competence to bring forth a reading of the East that the West can understand, should be encouraged in every way to increase his competence and to make the results of his studies available. But the number of persons who can claim even such an initial competence is very small. Hmm. Therefore, it is absurd to suggest, as many laymen and scholars are doing today, that a large part of the course of study of our educational system should be devoted to, quote, understanding the East. Few persons are less helpful to the world than those educators infatuated with the magic of curriculum changes who think that the teachers or the teachability of any subject they dream of can spring into existence by curricular decree. It is irresponsible to suggest that the East can be given a major place in the education of everybody when no more than a handful of teachers exist who could decently commit themselves to the teaching of such courses. The, quote, understanding of the East that would emerge from such courses taught by instructors who had hastily, quote, read up on the East could set communication and understanding back for generations. Professor John D. Wild of Harvard has lately commented on some educational proposals of Professor Howard Mumford Jones of Harvard. Mr. Wilde says, quote, I gather that Mr. Jones is worried about our capacity really to understand Russia and to set up a cooperative world community. So am I, but I am unable to follow him in the assumption that these crucially important aims will be achieved merely by setting up more machinery, professors and secretaries, more fields and areas called, quote, the study of Russia and, quote, the study of the Orient. How are these things to be studied? From what sort of integrating point of view? Is he proposing an amalgam of Western, Chinese, and Russian culture? If so, what would this be like? Or is he proposing a sort of cultural relativism in which everyone seeks to divest himself, so far as possible, from all the culture he had? I do not believe that Mr. Jones is advocating either of these alternatives. I gather that he is interested in correcting the economic and social injustices that distort our present civilization, that he wishes to see the vast power which modern technology has put into our hands used intelligently for the common good. All this is in line with the best philosophical and religious thought of our Western tradition, when properly understood. I gather further that he feels that we should be humble about the rather rudimentary civilization we now possess at this early stage, precious as it is, and that we should be open to suggestions from alien sources. This also is thoroughly in line with what is best in our own tradition. If this is what Mr. Jones means, when what we need most of all is to recall the basic insights and principles, religious as well as philosophical, upon which our Western culture was founded, and then apply them to the critical problems of our time. So also Professor Lewis M. Norris. Professor Jones has entered a strong and just plea for the relevance of education to its times. But there is grave danger here that the timelessness of education should obscure its timelessness. Socrates and Plato, as Professor Jones says, and even more truly Aristotle, struggled with the local political problem. But the very reason they were able to make such helpful comments about social, ethical, and political questions was that they were even more concerned to find out the forms of things that were timeless. Without the definitions of Socrates, the ideas of Plato, and the forms of Aristotle, their radio commentating would have been shallow gibberish, forgotten as soon as 99% of present commentary. A frantic concern to understand Russia or the Orient will lead us nowhere unless the student brings to these problems skill in analysis, order in valuing, knowledge of history, and such social experience as gives him a basis for judging what he finds out about Russia and the Orient. There is no reason why the West should feel that it must apologize for a determination to retain and renew a sense of its own character and its own range. Western civilization is one of the greatest civilizations to date, not in a spirit of arrogance, but in a spirit of concern that nothing good be lost for the future. The West should take to its meetings with the East a full and vivid sense of its own achievements. Nothing in the main line of the Western tradition leads to ethnocentric pride or cultural provincialism. If the West has been guilty of these sins, it is not because of its fidelity to its own character, but because of the many kinds of human weakness that always afflict any successful society. In quotations. Moreover, if we are to believe such an eminent student of this matter as Kumaraswamy, the Western tradition contains within itself elements that permit bridging to the deepest elements of Eastern tradition. Presumably, we can build these bridges best if we understand the nature of the ground where the bridge begins. Kumaraswamy says, if ever the gulf between East and West, of which we are made continually more aware as physical intimacies are forced upon us, is to be bridged, it will be only by an agreement on principles. A philosophy identical with Plato's is still a living force in the East. Understanding requires a recognition of common values. For so long as men cannot think with other peoples, they have not understood, but only known them. And in this situation, it is largely an ignorance of their own intellectual heritage that stands in the way of understanding and makes an unfamiliar way of thinking to seem queer. The irony here is that those who talk most about the need to change the course of study in order to promote understanding of the East would be those who would proclaim most loudly the obsolescence of those parts of the Western tradition, for example, Plato, Plotinus, Augustine, and the Western mystical and metaphysical tradition, which are perhaps equivalent with some transformation to the important parts of Eastern traditions. Such people would vigorously oppose an education requiring everybody to try to understand those things in the West which have the best chance of leading to a genuine understanding of the East. But for all that they vigorously propose that we understand, the East. The more dogmatic of those who feel that most of the Western tradition is obsolete, and who take scientific humanism as the new religion, are not likely to regard the problems of relations with the East as one of understanding, though they will use the phrase. They will see in the East little but backwardness, and will mark down Eastern ritual and mysticism as something scheduled for early technological demolition. One can imagine the indignant astonishment with which a beneficent American social engineer would greet the word of an earnest and respected student of the East, Rene Guénon, that, quote, everything in the East is seen as the application and extension of a doctrine which in essence is purely intellectual and metaphysical. Any widespread achievement of understanding between East and West will have to wait on the production of an adequate supply of liberally educated Westerners. Meanwhile, the problem is simply how to produce such a supply. The pretense that we are now prepared within the educational system at large to include understanding the East as one main pivot in a liberal curriculum will obstruct, not assist, the solution of the central problem of producing a liberal educated generation, liberally educated generation. Unquestionably, all the purposes that validate the publication of great books led logically to great books of the world, not of any part of the world. But at the moment, we have all we can do to understand ourselves in order to be prepared for the forthcoming meetings between East and West. Those who want to add more great books of Eastern origin are deceiving themselves. The time for that will come when we have understood our own tradition well enough to understand another. We may take to heart the message given the West by one of the great modern representatives of another culture. Charles Malik has said, in all this, we are really touching upon the great present crisis in Western culture. We are saying when that culture mends its own spiritual fences, all will be well with the Near East and not with the Near East alone. We are saying it is not a simple thing to be the heir of the Greco-Roman Christian European synthesis and not to be true to its deepest visions. One can take the 10 greatest spirits in that synthesis and have them judge the performance of the Western world in relation to the Near East. The deep problem of the Near East then must await the spiritual recovery of the West. And he does not know the truth who thinks what the West does, who thinks that the West does not have its own traditions. Try that again. And he does not know the truth who thinks that the West does not have in its own tradition the means and power wherewith it can once again be true to itself. Okay, last chapter. And we have approaches to this set, which I'll probably read. And then, I believe, we'll get into the stuff that this guy was writing. The preface of the Syntopicon, volume 2 of the entire set. I think this was one of the original printings. Copyright 1952. "72-year-old book." Definitely one of the oldest that I own. And in great shape. Make sure I'm not losing my hair. Not yet. Not too much anyway. That's what's important. Chapter 10. A letter to the reader. I imagine you reading this far in this set of books for the purpose of discovering whether you should read further. I will assume that you have been persuaded of the necessity and possibility of reading these books in order to get a liberal education. But how about you? The editors are not interested in general propositions about the desirability of reading the books. They want them read. They did not produce them as furniture for public or private libraries. We say that these books contain a liberal education and that everybody ought to try to get one. You say either that you have had one, that you are not bright enough to get one, or that you do not need one. You cannot have had one if you are an American under the age of 90. You can have acquired in the educational system only the faintest glimmerings of the beginnings of liberal education. Ask yourself what the whole great books you read while you were in school, college, or university. Ask yourself what whole great books you read while you were in school, college, or university. I read Moby Dick in college. Which is not on the original list, but it is on the amended list that you see in How to Read a Book. At the end of this in appendix A of How to Read a Book is, quote, a recommended reading list. On the following pages appears a list of books that it would be worth your while to read. And it's basically everything in great books of the Western world, plus some stuff that he thought also worth reading, I guess. Which is a lot of stuff. So to me, this was always the list of the great books of the Western world, the recommended reading list. And I I created a list of 10 books, evidently, at the end. I put the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Divine Comedy, William Shakespeare Works, Gulliver's Travels, Inquiry into the Wealth of Nations, Federalist Papers, David Copperfield, Civil Disobedience, and Moby Dick. Since then, I really haven't read any Shakespeare. Did not start reading Inquiry into the Wealth of Nations. Didn't read Federalist Papers. Listened to some David Copperfield. Read all of Moby Dick. I think I read like the first half of the Divine Comedy. I don't think I ever read Civil Disobedience. Well, just a short essay. But I did read all of highlighted a bunch of stuff too. I did read all of Ralph Waldo Emerson's writings, which I think was probably a good choice because it's not like crazy hard to understand, somewhat relevant to my time. Choice for me personally, probably in the short term. All right. You said ask yourself what whole great books you read while you were in school, college, or university. Ask yourself whether you and your teachers saw these books as a great conversation among the finest minds of Western history, and whether you obtained an understanding of the tradition in which you live. Ask yourself whether you mastered the liberal arts. I am willing to wager that if you read any great books at all, you read very few, that you read one without reference to the others in separate courses, and that for the most part you read only excerpts from them. As for me, I was educated in two very, quote, liberal colleges. Apart from Shakespeare, who was scattered through my education, I read one of the books in this set, Goethe's Faust, and part of another, a few of the dialogues of Plato, as part of my formal education. I do not remember that I ever heard the name of Thomas Aquinas or Plotinus when I was in college. I am not even sure that I heard of Karl Marx. I heard of many of the great scientific writers, but avoided association with them on the ground that they were too difficult for me. I gloried in the passion of an unmathematical, quote, unmathematical mind, and I did not need to read them because I was not going to be a scientist. But suppose that you have in some way hammered out for yourself the kind of education that colleges ought to give. If you have done so, you belong to a rare and small species. Rare and small, but not unknown. If you have read all these books, read them again. What makes them great is, among other things, that they teach you something every time you read them. Every time you see something you had not seen before, you understand something you had missed. No matter how hard your mind worked before, it works again. And this is the point. Every man's mind ought to keep working all his life long. Every man's imagination should be touched as often as possible by the great works of imagination. Every man ought to push toward the horizons of his intellectual powers all the time. It is possible to have, quote, had a liberal education, except in a formal. It is impossible to have, quote, had a liberal education, except in a formal, accidental, immaterial sense. Liberal education ought to end only with life itself. I must reiterate that you can set no store by your education in childhood and youth, no matter how good it was. Childhood and youth are no time to get an education. They're time to get ready to get an education. The most that we can hope for from these uninteresting and chaotic parts of life is that during them we shall be set on the right path, the path of realizing our human possibilities through intellectual effort and aesthetic appreciation. The great issues now, issues of life and death for civilization, call for mature minds. There is a simple test of this. Take any great book that you read in school or college and have not read since, read it again. Your impression that you understood it will at once be corrected. Think what it means, for instance, to read Macbeth at 16 in contrast to reading it at 35. We can understand Macbeth as Shakespeare meant us to understand it only when we have had some experience, vicarious or otherwise, of marriage and ambition. To read great books, if we read them at all in childhood and youth, and never read them again, is never to understand them. Can you ever understand them? There is a sense in which nobody can. That is why the great conversation never ends. Jean Cocteau said that each great work in Western thought arises as a contradiction of one that precedes it. This is not the result of the perversity or vanity of these writers. Nobody can make so clear and comprehensive and accurate a statement of the basic issues of human life as to close the discussion. Every statement calls for explanation, correction, modification, expansion, or contradiction. There is, too, the infinite suggestiveness of great books. They lead us to other books, other thoughts, other questions. They enlarge the fund of ideas we have and relate themselves to those we possess. Since the suggestiveness of great books is infinite, we cannot get to the end of them. We cannot say we understand these books in the sense that we are finished with them and what they have to teach us. The question for you is only whether you can ever understand these books well enough to participate in the great conversation, not whether you can understand them well enough to end it. And the answer is that you can never know until you try. We have built up around the classics such an atmosphere of pedantry. We have left them so long to the scholarly dissectors that we think of them as incomprehensible to the ordinary man to whom they were originally addressed. At the same time, our education has undergone so drastic a process of dilution that we are ill-equipped, even after graduation, for a respectable college to tackle anything much above the level of the comic book. What's wrong with comic books? The decay of education in the West, which is felt most profoundly in America, undoubtedly makes the task of understanding these books more difficult than it was for earlier generations. In fact, my observation leads me to the horrid suspicion that these books are easier for people who have had no formal education than they are for those who have acquired that combination of misinformation, unphilosophy, and slipshod habits that is the usual habit of the most elaborate and expensive institutional education in America. For one thing, those who have had no formal education are less likely to labor under prejudices about the writers contained in the set. They have not heard, or at least not so often, that these authors are archaic, unrealistic, and incomprehensible. They approach the books as they would approach any others, with a much more open mind than their more sophisticated and more miseducated contemporaries. They have not been frightened by their education. If you will pick up any one of these books and start to read it, you will find it not nearly so formidable as you thought. In one way, the great books are the most difficult, in another way, the easiest books for any of us to read. They are the most difficult because they deal with the most difficult problems that men can face, and they deal with them in terms of the most complex ideas. But treating the most difficult subjects of human thought, the great books are the clearest and simplest expression of the best thinking that can be done on these subjects. On the fundamental problems of mankind, there are no easier books to read. If you will pick up any other after you have read the first, you will find that you understand the second more easily than you did the first, and the first better than you did before. The criteria for choosing each book in this set were excellence of construction and composition, immediate intelligibility on the aesthetic level, increasing intelligibility with deeper reading and analysis, leading to maximum depth and a maximum range of significance with more than one level of meaning and truth. In our colleges, the curriculum is often so arranged that taking one course is made prerequisite to taking another. The pedagogical habit ingrained by such arrangements may prompt the question, what reading is prerequisite to reading great books? The answer is simply none. For the understanding of great books, it is not necessary to read background materials or secondary works about them. But there is one sense in which the reading of a great book may involve prerequisite reading. Except for Homer, the authors of great books, who come later in the course of the great conversation, enter into it themselves as a result of reading the earlier authors. Thus, Plato was a reader of the Homeric poems and of the tragedies and comedies, and Aristotle is a reader of all of these, and Plato, too. Dante and Montaigne are readers of most of Dante and Montaigne are readers of most of the Greek and Roman books, not only the poetry and history, but the science and philosophy as well. John Stuart Mill, Karl Marx, William James, and Sigmund Freud are readers of almost all the books in this set. This suggests that we as readers of a particular great book can be helped in reading it by reading first some of the books its authors read before writing it. The chronological order of the works in this set is a good reading order, precisely because earlier books are, in a way, the prerequisite reading for later books. But though earlier books prepare for later ones, it is also true that reading one great book makes reading another easier, no matter in what order they are read. For earlier books contribute to the education of the authors of later ones. The later authors do more than reflect this influence. They also comment on and interpret the meaning of the earlier works. They report and take issue with the opinions of their predecessors. Looked at forward or backward in the time sequence, one great book throws light on another, and as the number of great books one has read in any order increases, the voices in the great conversation tend more and more to speak in the present tense, as if all the authors were contemporaneous with one another, responding directly to each other's thought. It takes imaginative and intellectual work to read a book, and facility and achievement grow by exercise in this set. Period. By exercise. Period. In this set, each book is readable ultimately because of its place in the tradition. These books are aware of and responsive to other books, to those which come after them, as well as to those which came before. Any good book that is not in the set should be able to find itself subsumed under and related to these great books. Any man should be able, perhaps with some effort, to find his own mind belonging to the discourse in these books. Some degree of understanding of these books should convince you that you are able to read and understand progressively any good book, and to criticize with integrity and security anything written for publication. These books are genuinely intelligible, perhaps late and with difficulty, but ultimately and intrinsically. Do you need a liberal education? We say that it is unpatriotic not to read these books. You may reply that you are patriotic enough without them. We say that you are gravely cramping your human possibilities if you do not read these books. You may answer that you have troubles enough already. This answer is the one that Ortega attacks in The Revolt of the Masses. It assumes that we can leave all intellectual activity and political responsibility to somebody else and live our lives as vegetable beneficiaries of the moral and intellectual virtue of other men. The trouble with this assumption is that whereas it was once possible and even compulsory for the bulk of mankind, such indulgence now on the part of anybody endangers the whole community. It is now necessary for everybody to try to live, as Ortega says, at the height of his times. The democratic enterprise is imperiled if any one of us says, I do not have to try to think for myself, or make the most of myself, or become a citizen of the world republic of learning. The death of democracy is not likely to be an assassination from ambush. It will be a slow extinction from apathy, indifference, and undernourishment. The reply that Edmund Burke gave to the movement for the extension of the suffrage is the one that the majority of men unconsciously supports. Burke developed the doctrine of virtual representation, which enabled him to claim that all power should reside in the hands of the few, in his case, in the hands of the landed aristocracy. They had the qualifications for governing: intelligence, leisure, patriotism, and education. They virtually represented the rest of the community, even though the rest of the community had not chosen them to do so. Burke was not interested in the education of the people because though government was to be conducted by their interest. It was unthinkable that they could determine what their interest was. They had neither the information, the intelligence, nor the time to govern themselves. I have often endeavored, he says, to compute and to class those who, in any political view, are to be called the people. In England and Scotland, I compute that those of adult age, not declining in life, of tolerable leisure for such discussions, and of some means of information, and who are above menial dependence, or what virtually is such, may amount to about 400,000. At that time, the population of the British Isles was between 8 and 10 million. This is indeed the only reply that can be made to the demand for universal suffrage. It is an attack, and a direct one, on the essential principle of democracy. The virtual representatives of the people are, in Burke's view, in no sense accountable to them. They are responsible to their own consciences and perhaps to God. But the only way in which the people could call their virtual representatives to time would be through revolution, a prospect that Burke would be the first to deprecate. In his view, only those in possession of power are in a position to decide whether or not they should have it. On this principle, any totalitarian dictatorship can justify itself. Dramatically opposed to a position such as that of Burke is the American faith in democracy and in education in relation to democracy. Stated sufficiently by Jefferson, I know of no safe depository of the ultimate powers of society, but the people themselves, and if we think them not enlightened enough to exercise their control with a wholesome discretion, the remedy is not to take it from them, but to inform their discretion by education. We who say, then, that we believe in democracy cannot content ourselves with virtual education any more than we can with virtual representation. We have not the option of deciding for ourselves whether or not we shall be liberal artists, because we are committed to the proposition that all men shall be free. We cannot admit that ordinary people cannot have a good education, because we cannot agree that democracy must involve a degradation of the human ideal. Anything less than the effort to help everybody get the best education necessarily implies that some cannot achieve in their own measure our human ideal. We cannot concede that the conquest of nature, the conquest of drudgery, and the conquest of political power must lead, in combination, to triviality in education, and hence in all the other occupations of life. The aim of education is wisdom, and each must have the chance to become as wise as he can. Possible approaches to this set. Just a few pages, I think. For reasons that have been given, the editors decided against any prefaces or explanatory apparatus in the several volumes of this set. The decision was made to let the great books speak for themselves. The editors believe that the great books do not need explanation in order to be comprehended by the ordinary reader. But the ordinary reader, considering this set as a whole, may well ask where he should begin reading and how he should proceed. The editors have several suggestions to offer. The first suggestion is a reminder that the Syntopicon, which comprises volumes 2 and 3, provides one kind of answer to the question about where to start and where to go in the reading of the set as a whole. The Syntopicon invites the reader to make on the set whatever demands arise from his own problems and interests. It is constructed to enable the reader, no matter what the stages of his reading and other ways, to find that part of the great conversation in which any topic that interests him is being discussed. As explained in the preface to the Syntopicon, its 2,987 topics are organized under 102 basic ideas, to each of which a chapter is devoted. Particular topics can be located by reference to the 1,798 key terms listed in the inventory of terms. When the reader has located the topic of his interest, the Syntopicon shows him how to follow the discussion of it that occurs in the 25 centuries of the Great Conversation. The preface to the Syntopicon, Volume 2, further explains its structure and describes the various uses to which it can be put as a guide to the contents of this set as a whole. The Syntopicon helps the reader to begin reading in the great books on any subject or subjects in which he is interested, and to follow one idea or one theme through the books from beginning to end. Such syntopical reading in the set as a whole, for its varied discourse on a particular theme, supplements the gradual reading of the books taken as individual wholes. Valuable in itself, syntopical reading should bring the reader to an acquaintance with the whole set, and thus prepare him to select the particular books you'll wish to start reading as wholes. Yet apart from the help he will get from syntopical reading, the ordinary reader may still ask with what book he should begin and in what order he should proceed to read the works in this set. One answer is, of course, that he can begin at the beginning, or with any book that especially interests him, and go where the book themselves will lead him. As part of the great conversation, one book naturally leads to another, both forward and backward in the time sequence. Each book also leads to many others that deal with the same subject, or have some affinity in style or treatment. If the reader wishes to concentrate for a time on books dealing with one subject matter, or with books of a certain kind, such as poetry, history, philosophy, or science, he will find some guidance in the colors in which the books are bound. The volumes bound in yellow contain epic and dramatic poetry, satires, and novels. Those bound in blue contain histories and works in ethics, economics, politics, and jurisprudence. Those bound in green contain mathematics and the natural sciences, works in astronomy, physics, chemistry, biology, and psychology. Those bound in red contain philosophy and theology. That's cool. There's an example above my head. I don't know if they kept that theme with subsequent printings. I really wish the used bookstore I found these first 3 volumes in had the full set. They had parts of it. Maybe I should have bought as many as I could. Probably. The original set. They were like so cheap. $2.50 a piece or something. Since individual volumes often include many works by a single author, and sometimes the works of several authors, the classification of the volumes according to the kinds or subject matters indicated above could not always be an adequate representation of their contents. Each volume is placed in one or another of the four large groupings in terms of the predominant character of an author's work. But the works of certain authors cross the line of this or any other simple classification, and certain authors contribute major works in a variety of fields. For example, volume 53, which contains William James's Principles of Psychology, is grouped with works in natural science, but it also deserves to be considered as a contribution to philosophy. Volumes 7, 8, and 9, which contain the writings of Plato and Aristotle, or volumes 19, 20, 31, 33, 42, and 46, which contain the writings of Aquinas, Descartes, Pascal, Kant, and Hegel, are classified as philosophy and theology because that accords with the predominant character of their authors. But among the writings that these volumes contain are works in moral and political science, in jurisprudence, in mathematics, in physics, and in biology. The color of the binding, therefore, serves only as a rough indication of the grouping of the authors in the works according to their literary character or their subject matter. For a more precise selection of individual works of a certain sort, the reader must consult the actual titles of the works that comprise great books of the Western world. With few exceptions, they plainly indicate the character of the works they name. To aid the reader in making this selection for himself, if he wishes to concentrate on the subject matter or one kind of book, the editors have provided on pages 93 to 110 a complete enumeration, volume by volume, of the full titles of all the works included in the great books of the Western world. Still, another suggestion can be offered in response to the question about the order of reading the books. The editors have used these books for many years in teaching young people and in leading discussions with groups of adults. They have found that reading whole works of integral parts of works in chronological order and in an ascending scale of difficulty is an effective way of going through the books. This plan has been widely used in the reading courses in great books that are now conducted by some colleges and universities and by the Great Books Foundation in its program of liberal education for adults. It is a plan that is equally good for individual reading. This plan of reading for this set is set forth on pages 112 to 131. It consists of reading lists for 10 successive years. And in their general pattern, these reading lists resemble the lists that have been tried and tested by the Great Books Foundation, but they differ in many particulars, largely as a result of the fact that works that are included in the present lists were not procurable or readily available until the publication of Great Books of the Western World. In this 10-year plan of reading, there are 18 selections for each year. And for each selection, the reader is given, in addition to author and title, the volume and page numbers that quickly locate the selection in this set of books. The selections in each list follow, with one exception, the order of the volumes. That one exception occurs in the first year, where Plato's Apology and Crito in volume 7 were placed before Aristophanes' Clouds and Lysistrata in volume 5, because these dialogues of Plato constitute so excellent an introduction to the great conversation. The arrangement of the selections according to the order of the volumes in which they are to be found places the readings recommended in each list in the chronological order of the great conversation itself. Again, there are a few exceptions that result from the fact that some volumes in the set, in which several authors are grouped together, contain writings that are one or more centuries apart in time. Each list includes a wide variety of books, almost always poetry, history, and morals or politics, as well as theology, philosophy, and science. The 180 selections recommended in the 10 lists represents every author included in the Great Books of the Western World, though they by no means exhaust the contents of this set. For certain authors, notably the poets and novelists, the recommended readings cover all their work here published, but for other authors, the selections are only a fair sampling of the range and variety of their contributions to the great conversation. Because the brevity of the selections was one consideration in the construction of these lists, especially in the early years, it was necessary to recommend, in the case of certain long works, the reading of successive portions in successive years. But whenever the parts of a single work are divided among several years, or whenever different works by the same author are placed in successive years, these selections are so arranged that the reader is carried through a particular book or through a number of works in an order that accords with the structure of the book or the relation of the works. Each list has several centers of interest or several connecting themes. Each list represents several phases of the great conversation. The lists get more difficult from year to year in two ways. The selections get longer, and they deal with more difficult subject matters. The list for the 10th year, for example, assumes that the reader has completed the reading suggested for the other 9, and that the reading he has already engaged in and the books he has already read afford him a certain facility and background for understanding these selections in the 10th year. The reader who completes this 10-year program will have become acquainted with the range and depth of the great conversation. Completing a program of this sort, he will have read in whole or part all the authors, though not all the works of every author. He will have a sense of the relations of the authors to one another and of the variety and relations of the ideas with which they deal. He will be in a position to take part in the great conversation and should be able to carry his reading of great books on for the rest of his life under the direction of his own interests. all the contents. This is actually, this is probably the only place you can see the contents of the set. "54 volumes. Wow. I included Dostoevsky. Volume 52. The Brothers Karamazov. And they did include Herman Melville in the Dostoevsky. Fyodor Dostoevsky. And they did include Herman Melville. Volume 48. Moby Dick. Faust. Volume 47. Straight up novels. Count Leo Tolstoy, War and Peace, 51. Volume 51. Edward Gibbon, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, is 2 volumes, 40 and 41. I wonder if it's the complete set, because that is a lot of text. If it's got to be abridged. Chapters 1 to 40, chapters 41 to... Because I have this one here. This one's 71 chapters as well. Oh, okay. This tells me everything that's in Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, most of which is not included in this volume. So this is The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, greatly abridged. It's like less than half, by the looks of it, of what was actually originally published. But looks to me like they have the complete set in. That would take such a long time. It's like, hey, here's something you can spend your entire life doing. What do you think? I guess. If I'm not busy doing something else, although I would rather be busy doing something else, to be honest. I feel like all of this is just for people who have something better to do. Leisure. They have too much leisure. Ajax. Plutarch. The lives of the noble Grecians and Romans. Theseus, Romulus. Romulus and Theseus compared. Lycurgus, Numa Pompilius. Lycurgus and Numa compared. Solon, Poplicola and Solon compared. Themistocles, Camillus, Pericles, Fabius and Pericles compared. Alcibiades, Coriolanus, Timoleon, Emilius Paulus, and Atilius, Marcellus and Pelopidas. Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, I think the important thing is to understand is that you don't have to fucking read everything that's in there, or none of it. You could probably just read some of it and have your life greatly influenced by what you do read. That's probably why a lot of people don't read it at all. It's because they think, oh, how could I possibly read all of this and be done with it? That would take my entire life. It's not something I can do. It's not like a course I can do in a few weeks. Although they did do like a Great Books course for adults. I think they tried to do that. Mortimer Adler, editor-in-chief. William Gorman. You always were an asshole, Gorman. I'm kind of interested in your bibliography. Inventory of terms. The additional suggested reading. Yeah. Everything that didn't make it in here into the list. Here's Emerson. Essays. Complete essays. Nature, representative men. See English traits. Society and Solitude. Therinity. Threnody in complete essays. Threnody? That wasn't in my essential writings volume. The heck is that? Threnody. Natural History of Intellect. That was in there. English Traits, Representative Men, and Other Essays. That was in there. Conduct of Life, Nature, and Other Essays. The American Scholar, an oration delivered before the Phi Beta Kappa Society. Demetrius. Beowulf. William Blake. William Blackstone. Joseph Black. St. Thomas Aquinas. All right. Well, I think I'm going to get into this stuff tomorrow. Just a short stream today. And start reading the preface. The nature of the Syntopicon. And get through the preface. Probably skip explanation of reference style. And then I'll start reading the different introductions to the great ideas. One by one, A to Z. Because why not? It seems like good content. Easy, intelligible, English. Not to think too hard. Good introductory content to the ideas discussed in the great conversation. Right? Not too crazy. And I like Mortimer Adler as an author, and I'm pretty sure he wrote most of it.